Thanks everyone for coming, or for those of you taking a look at this later. So my name is Jeannie Fromer. I'll start out by telling you what I do now briefly, but then because it's such an unusual um, place to be to talk about in talking about a STEM path, then I want to take a step back and explain how I got there. So I'm currently a professor of intellectual property law and vice dean at NYU Law School. Now that seems perhaps like a strange thing to be talking about STEM in, but I think it connects pretty nicely, and I'll explain how I got there. I will say that as a kid, I definitely had a strong interest in coding and computer science, much more primitive at the time. This is like, I think one of the earliest computers I had a version of this. It's something that connected up to your TV, and you could code in BASIC on it. And so I enjoyed that when I was younger, although I didn't think too much about it as a career path at the time. And then I got to college. And when I got to college, I I thought at the moment that I got there, I was at Barnard at Columbia, and I thought when I got there that I was likely to want to go to law school. I'd always thought law school was something I'd wanted to do, and because of that, I thought and understood, and it is true, you could study anything and go to law school. There's not one path to doing that. And I thought, okay, I will study what I'm most interested in. And a friend took me to a computer science class with her. And I absolutely loved it. And I will tell you, it was, it ended up that I decided I'm going to study computer science, even though it was considered the hardest thing to study at school. This was ended up being my advisor. Her name is Kathy McCune. She was a real inspiration to me. I'll tell you a little bit more about her, but she was really encouraging of my pathway. She does research in artificial intelligence, and in particular in natural language processing, also sometimes called computational linguistics, in which you're working on getting computers to either understand or generate English. This used to be much more complicated to explain when there weren't consumer products that did this as well as we've got now. But I did work with her, and ultimately, before I ended up graduating, I ended up co-authoring a paper with her and some colleagues that was published on using different techniques to coordinate graphic and language displays when you're producing language and you're producing graphic output. And I'm glad to talk more about that with you guys if that's of interest. But taking a step back, at the moment in time that I did this, it was the early mid 1990s, which is ancient history in many ways, but it was at a moment in time where you got to college and you didn't even have an email address. And you were only allowed to get an email address easily if you were taking computer science courses. And so I went to and happily got my email address my first year in college, had like 3 friends with email addresses, and we wrote to each other like, you better respond over time. And so this was a very primordial early version of much of that. And also the other thing I'll say that connects to how, progressive research in this space is, those of you who've been using ChatGPT or other large language models, the way they work is they do this type of machine learning called reinforcement learning. What we did was new at the time. I think it's I think it was the first time that reinforcement learning was applied to language. And now it's, at the time, there was no data, there was no computing power. And there was less advancement in the field. And we tried this thing out, and now it's being used in like incredibly more sophisticated ways with all the data and computing power that there is to do things like ChatGPT. So that's really cool to see that happening. Okay, so how do I end up being a law professor? During this time, as much as I'm enjoying coding and the high level of this and all the cool things I'm learning in the space, I kept thinking I'm really interested in how society interacts with technology. How do we encourage good technology in society? How do we discourage bad technology? What role does law and government play in that? And I was really interested in that. That felt so distinct from what I was able to do. And so it got me thinking about law school again. And so on a lark, I decided to apply to law school. I took a leave of absence from my PhD program, which was in progress. I'd finished my master's on the way, and I took a leave, and I went a little bit uptown in Cambridge to Harvard Law School. And I just fell in love with the ability to study law. It felt very similar in some ways at an analytical level to computer science or engineering, because you're breaking things down and processing things. It can be more frustrating because there are fewer right answers. And so you have to deal with a lot more gray. But I really loved it. And I became an editor at the Harvard Law Review. And as a student, and I worked on scholarship, and I really thought this is really interesting. And so I was interested in lots of law broadly, but I was interested particularly in intellectual property. And I felt like that would really quench my thirst to be doing things at the intersection of law, science, and engineering, and studying these questions I was interested in about society. So what is intellectual property? There are lots of types of it. There are patents, there are copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets. But one of the things that's fundamental is that the law provides exclusive rights to people for different things they create. And the main reason is to encourage them to create in the first place, because if you create something, it can easily be copied. So, just to give you an example, like if I give you a pen, I no longer have the pen, and the pen is yours, and you could write with it. You could do whatever you want. You could use up the ink. At some point, the ink will run out. You'll need to replace the ink, get a new pen. Okay, and it's done. If I tell you my idea, I still have it. That's number one. So that's different than giving you a pen. But it also doesn't get depleted each time we use the idea. It still stays. The ink doesn't run out, in the equivalent. And so there's always been a worry that if we want people to generate new ideas and come up with new things based on new ideas, um, that people are going to be able to copy them easily, because once you disclose your idea, everyone can use it. And so the law steps in to make inventions sometimes more like pens and say, no, you have a patent on this invention. Other people can't use it. It's not okay. And if you do that without permission, you'll be liable for patent infringement. And so I thought this is this incredibly interesting space where we have these tools to play around with, encouraging people to create, and sometimes pulling them back, because sometimes too much protection is not good, because we do want people to share things and work on things together. And I'm glad to talk more about that. And so that's what kind of led me into the law. And so I went to practice in intellectual property at a law firm for a little bit after that. And then I was fortunate to, for a year, do a clerkship on the US Supreme Court for Justice Souter. That is a 1-year gig that people sometimes have after law school. Each of the 9 justices has 4 clerks, and you get to work on cases with them. It is such a cool experience, especially after law school and you're reading Supreme Court cases, to actually get to work on them. It's also scary because you're actually having impact on Supreme Court decisions that are coming out, but it's really a very special experience. And I was also lucky the year that I clerked, there were a bunch of intellectual property cases, including a big one involving eBay. And so I got to think through that and work on shaping that, and the decisions there too. After that, I knew I wanted to be an academic. I mean, what I was interested in was really thinking through these pieces. I also enjoyed like applying it as a lawyer and taking a side and trying to do the best for my side. But I think like what became clear to me by trying out different things, which we could also talk about because I think that's a key ingredient in getting to a place of happiness in what you're doing in your career, is that I really like thinking through how I thought the law should look in order to achieve the goals it wants to achieve. And so I ultimately became a law professor at NYU. So that's my convoluted story of how I started directly, smackly in STEM, but still do something that's quite connected to STEM, just not in the most conventional way. So I hope that's given you a good overview, and I'm happy to talk further if there's interest.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. So if anyone has questions, feel free to either raise your hand or unmute it. I mean, it's actually interesting. So one comment and then one question. The first one is I actually last year did an engineering project where we basically made a Roomba that went up the stairs. So that was kind of cool. And then the other thing is one of the aspects of our robotics competition actually is, and generally I think it's all, collaboration in general. But also we have to write what they call an engineering portfolio, which is a 15-page summary of all the engineering that we did and all the outreach and things like that. And I definitely think it's been an interesting question of whether you know about sharing things really and like our ideas because ultimately we're all competing to have the best robot and also to have the best overall package, I should say. And so I was just wondering, I guess, what your thoughts on that were. So another thing that we're working on is a sister team kind of manual where we're going to be writing some sort of handbook on how to like basically coexist with other teams when you're sharing a space or mentors or things like that. And so I was just kind of wondering your opinion on that.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question, and I'm glad you're reflecting on this, even if it's challenging, because I think it really reflects, what happens in, even in like the business setting in this space, because often businesses have different approaches. Some of them think that they're better off sharing certain information, and the reasons for sharing that information can vary, and there are some businesses that don't want to share things and are much more locked down. And so I think the reasons to lock down are very similar to what you're invoking here, is that you have competitors in the space, right? They may not be business competitors, but they're competitors. You're all working toward the same thing. And if you're giving them your ideas, they can grab them, take them, and maybe get to a better place than you, or to as good of a place as you, in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do on their own. And I think that's a real fear. And at the same time, there are these studies that show that when society has there's some goal to get a solution, let's say, like, so for example, like I think NASA did the study with others. They had a programming problem to solve that hadn't been addressed, and they decided to throw it out there. And so some professors got them to do it as an experiment, where some people were in a contest where they couldn't see other people's solutions, and some people were in a contest where they could. And the place where they couldn't see other people's solutions, they did not get to as good of a solution ultimately. So the winning did not get to a good as good of a solution because they couldn't see and build on each other's materials, and the ones where they were able to share it, the best solution emerged. But the best solution was definitely building on other people's. And so when you're in a head-to-head competition, I think it's more clear cut that you probably want to keep things a little more locked down, especially if you've got like some really interesting insight. But it's not necessarily good for society, and that's like I think the interesting takeaway, that it's often better to share. And the there's a conflict between the selfish interest and societal interest. And so I'd say like it's very clear cut in the context of the contest because it's short term to some extent, right? I mean, you're working on a certain project one year and then you're working on another one another year. And there are businesses, though, that really think that they do better by sharing. And the reasons they think that they do better by sharing is, one, they want a lot of people to adopt what they're doing. And that's a way to get people to adopt what they're working on. So this will happen, for example, with like programming languages. Java, for example, was openly released, and the idea would be a lot of people would learn it and use it. If it were locked down, people wouldn't have done that. So that's one context in which it's often good to share. There are other contexts in which, if you share a lot of information, then people will come to you. They'll see you as the experts, and then they'll come hire you to customize things for them. And so you'll be doing that. But it's really like targeted to your particular approach. And I will also say that if part of your approach is like, let's say, getting a patent for what you've invented, you think you've invented something, it's got to be new and not obvious in order to get a patent on it. You don't want to share it too broadly because the law will say you can't get a patent if it's been out there publicly, because then it's not new anymore. And you could even, so not only is someone else doing it going to get in the way of getting your patent, someone else did it before you, but if you disclose something and then wait too long to try to get a patent, you're going to get in the way of yourself. So, and a lot of people don't realize that and get into trouble when they're trying to get a patent on something that their own disclosures got in their own way. So there are a lot of things that are out there that are either internal incentives or legal incentives that it's important to keep things locked down. And so I would suggest that, like, general principles, you're writing things up, you should always be putting things together for your own team for the future, especially for the things that are general lessons, or to look back on things and see and see about learning it. And I think that that's important. And then there might be some moment at which the contest is over and you might release some of this publicly at that point, but I'd probably be cautious and keep it to myself more rather than less during the period of the competition. So that's a long answer to tell you that you're touching on really important issues that come up in the business world, but with slightly different, ways that they get pushed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think I have a lot of things now to look into. Definitely I'm gonna look at that study. And I'm gonna look back at the recording and make sure I look into everything that you just said. But yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Does anybody else have a question? Now's the time to raise your hand or unmute. And if not, then next week, I think we are not having a Zoom because of Thanksgiving. But we'll see everybody the week after. Thank you again, Jeanne, for speaking, and thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, this was great.
Thanks for having me. Enjoy your Thanksgiving break and good luck with the competitions.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.